Thanks for joining us today. We probably don't need microphones, but we're going to use them anyway, just to make sure you hear everything. If you did not pick up a handout by the door, maybe, David, could you get those and hand them to people who don't have them? Thank you. This will be something we refer to later in the program. But I want to make sure you have a copy of that to take with you. For the one or two of you in the room who might not know, my name is Bob Stewart. I'm the director of the journalism school. And as you may have heard me talk about over the last year or so, the School of Journalism will be celebrating its 100th anniversary in 2023. So we've been doing a number of little programs rather than wait until 2023 to have one big program. We wanted to have several programs all along the way to highlight various alums and various anniversaries within the anniversary, within the larger anniversary. Today's program is not really about an anniversary per se, but it's about two people who I've gotten to know over the last few years. People I'd heard about many years as part of the folklore of the School of Journalism. And I was getting to know them kind of individually, and then I found out that they were fast friends. And I was intrigued by this idea that two people who graduated in 1952, who started their studies just 3 years after World War II ended, when Harry Truman was president, and John Baker had only been president of this university for 3 years, and we are in Baker, the original Baker Center, and it did not even exist yet in 1948. So we are talking about a period that seems a long time ago to us, but to these two friends from that era, I think they can remember a great deal of it, and when we hear them talk to each other about it, it's a very precious way to learn about our own history. So, we're coming up on the 100th anniversary of the school, but in 1948, when they started school here, we were just celebrating the 25th anniversary of the School of Journalism, to give you some perspective. Well, it's a friendship that started as they met in classes, but they took it to a deeper level as friends and really as classmates. As far as I know, they never dated or anything, but they really were very good friends, and that's what I want to have us talk about a little bit today, because I see them able to teach you how to nurture those kind of friendships that could last for the next 70 years. Right? These are, you can't imagine two better coaches on friendship than Sid Davis and Joanne Wood. So to celebrate their friendship, we are hosting this conversation with Joanne Harold Wood and Sid Davis. And I think you will be really glad that you came for this program. Now, just a little word of advertisement. We have this book that Sid actually wrote a piece in about L.J. Horton, who was the director of the school, the second director of the School of Journalism. So he has a piece in here, and there is a piece about him written by Drew Everts, who those of you who were at the banquet last night were kind to give her a standing ovation. That was very touching. But Sid and Joanne had some similarities in their careers and some differences, and we'll get to that. But first of all, I would like to ask them to tell us as much as they can remember about the early days of meeting each other and how that friendship took form.
You want to go first?
No.
You don't want to go first?
I'd like you to go first.
Okay.
You better.
Well, the campus was very different in those days. It wasn't as big. In our, when we were here, it had about 4,800 students. That made a big difference. The School of Journalism was much smaller. We both were in that. Sid was in broadcast, I was in print. And it was much more intimate, We knew a lot of people in our classes. We knew a lot of people like Jack Ellis, Well, he wasn't quite here at that time, were you? But I've known Jack for many, many years since then, when he came back to work here, and it was a different time. I remember, always calling people like Bob by their official names, like Dean so-and-so, or remember that? We never called anybody by their first names in those days. I'm much older than you, but that persisted for a while, and I never thought of calling a professor up at night and saying, I didn't understand what you said today, but I guess people do that too today. It was
Sparingly, students, sparingly. Don't give them too many ideas.
But the campus was great. I think, I know I got a good education. I enjoyed being here, and as a result of all that, I've remained a fan of Ohio University, and I've been retained a lot of friendships that I made there. Sid is one. I have a lot of women friends that I knew on campus, and 70-some years later, they're still friends, and we exchange Christmas cards and emails sometimes, and I hope you all have the same experience, good experience like I have. Sid?
Well, I came here in 1948. I got out of the Navy. I was in the Navy for 2 years. I went in the Navy right after college graduation. I served in the Navy aboard a heavy cruiser and with the occupation forces in Japan for about 2 years, and had to decide on a university to go to. And a friend of mine had attended. As a matter of fact, this man eventually hired me, a news director at a television radio station in Youngstown, Ohio, where I was born, has been at OU, and he was one of the people who told me about it. I looked it up. I drove down here with some friends, and two of us enrolled at Ohio University. And I knew that I wanted to be a journalist from day one, so from the time I was in my teens, or even younger than that. I was fascinated by the radio. My father would listen to CBS News all the time, and I was fascinated by the people at CBS News. And later, when I got to Washington, I got to meet some of them, and signed up for journalism. In the first year, though, you were in university college, so you didn't get much of anything but the general assignments, plus 1 hour 3 times a week of calisthenics. I must be honest with you, I did not appreciate the calisthenics. I had done that on the ship for 2 years, and I didn't feel like coming here to do what I was doing for 2 years in the Navy. But you had to take it. It was mandatory. In any case, I got to know L.J. Horton in the second year, probably, maybe the first, I'm not sure. And he just took over as a friend with most of us. He was very easy to get to. He was not difficult to talk to. He had been a wire service man for the Associated Press. He'd worked for small newspapers in various places. He had a solid idea of what he ought to teach and how he taught it. And as I said, and Joanne has indicated, he was accessible at any time that you wanted to talk to him. He ran the class as though he were still the city editor of a newspaper. He didn't stand at a desk and preach to you. He walked around the room and spoke individually to all of us as he was teaching and lecturing. So that gave the class a sense of informality that was very good for learning. And he didn't overload us with a lot of junk. If we had assignments to write, and he was a pretty good critic of the things he submitted. George Starr Lasher was the head of the school, and I didn't know him very well, but everybody on campus knew him at the time because he had certain manners about him. First, he had beautiful silver hair, and he was not a short man. I always pictured him as being shorter than he was. He was not. But he would come across the campus from wherever he lived on the warmest or coldest or wettest days.
He lived on the corner of
Court Street?
Yeah.
Court and Union,
Court.
above the bookstore.
Yep.
But he would come a caddy corner across the campus along one of the diagonal. You'd see him walking toward Ewing Hall across one of the diagonal walks. And he would have a bundle of probably New York Times. I don't think he'd be caught dead with anything less than New York Times, knowing Lasher. But he had this bundle of papers, and he was a figure, sort of a character. Seeing him come across the campus at a certain time, going to work with his bunch of papers. And I don't know how we got one every day or 100 every day, but he did do that, and that became kind of a Lasher characteristic. He was well known across the country as a journalism teacher. Was involved in a lot of national institutions involved with journalism. Horton was a little more a plainer guy. He's a foot soldier. He was a wire service guy, which is the toughest job in reporting, is being a wire service guy. You're in the dregs. You've got the worst, and you work more hours than anybody else. But that's the place to learn journalism. Get a job at a wire service first. I regret one thing I didn't do when I was matriculating, was that I did not get involved with print. And I think it would have been a very good idea. I'd have been a better reporter early on if I'd gone to work for a newspaper before I went to a radio television station. Even though the radio TV station I chose was one of the best in the country in terms of journalism. We were, as newsmen on WKBN radio and TV in Youngstown, we were not permitted to do commercials. We could only do news. We were not used as disc jockeys, which was a lot of places you were a disc jockey 1 hour, the next hour you're doing newscasts. It's like telling a doctor he had to be a musician or something for half the time as a doctor. You weren't going to learn it. So I regret that I didn't train in print. I'd have been better educated earlier. I caught on to it all because I worked with them and I had to get into detail and learn the other parts of it. And after 7 years in Youngstown, I had been in conversations with Dr. Horton, and at one point I called him and set up, and I wanted to get out of town. I'd been in Washington. I went to Washington actually every year that I was in Youngstown trying to get a job with the networks, but I couldn't because I didn't have any experience that they wanted. So I had to keep waiting until the barriers kind of disappeared with experience. And in Youngstown, I covered the worst. I covered the steel mills and labor relations, unions, the police station twice a day. I covered pimps and whores. I covered people out of work. I covered poverty. I had the whole ball of wax, the whole 9 yards. So my advice to students who want to be in journalism, don't go to work in Pleasant Valley. You're not going to learn anything. Go to the grimiest city you can find or the next grimiest city and work there, because you'll learn journalism pretty fast. You'll learn what real life is all about. You'll learn the sensitivities of whether you care about people or don't care about people. You'll see people who can't make it. And you have to learn to write about them as well as anybody else. That's my advice to journalists is, don't find the worst radio station in America. Go to the one you qualify with most, with the limited experience, or newspapers. The same way with a paper. Choose a place you want to work and learn.
So I want to come back to your campus days a little bit to hear a little bit about what really struck me when I was getting to know about this friendship was about how this sorority girl and this former Navy guy became friends and formed a part of a small group of journalism students who became a kind of a coffee and Danish group, and would meet every day. So I'd like to hear, I think everybody would be interested to hear a little bit about that group and why that was important to you during your studies.
Well, I remember some of the people. One of the other people at breakfast would be a student named Carl Laub, L-E-U-B, I pronounced it. There were a couple of others. There were about 4 people, and we would go to Quick's drugstore where they had a coffee shop. They had a lunch counter, which was unusual in drugstores today, but you could get a milkshake. But this place served breakfast. They had tables, actually, where you could sit down and have breakfast. And they served a toasted a cinnamon roll. That was a big thing. I think it was 15 cents for that. And I think you got a cup of coffee with it too. I'm not sure. But I don't know how many times we, looking back, I don't remember. It just seemed like we met more often than we did. But I got to know Joanne there. But Joanne was a Pi Phi. and she lived with us on Sorority Row, and I lived in a rooming house with 5 other guys on Washington Street, I think it runs in.
It's where the parking garage is right now.
It's a parking lot now.
Yeah.
And I got to know her by, I guess, walking to school, seeing her in class, and we just got to be friends. And over the years, when she was in, I was in touch with her when she was in Pittsburgh. She may not remember this some way when she.
I remember it.
Oh, do you? Okay.
Yes. He was covering a big story in Youngstown, and I was working for the Pittsburgh Press, which doesn't exist anymore. It was a Scripps-Howard paper. It was one of the leading Scripps-Howard papers at that time in the country, an evening paper. And you know what's happened to evening papers. So one day I was at my desk, and a reporter came back from a story in Youngstown, and he said, "I met someone who knows you." And I said, "Well, who was that?" And he said, "His name is Sid Davis, and he's a wonderful reporter on a radio station in Youngstown. And how does he know you?" I said, "Well, we went to college together." He said, "Oh, I see." But that's how that happened.
Well, we must have called each other after that some way.
Oh, I guess so.
I knew Joanne was working for the Pittsburgh Press. I knew that. I didn't know that you'd moved to Walter Thompson or whatever it was.
J. Walter Thompson,
J.
yes,
Walter
I moved
Thompson.
to J. Walter Thompson.
I didn't know that,
afterwards.
but we stayed in touch long after that. We became even closer friends by telephone. And when I learned that Joanne was a world-class dancer,
We'll get to that. I have a video.
I
We
got,
don't have to get into that.
well, anyway, I don't know, we got to talking, and she said, well, they had the championships or contests in near Youngstown in Boardman, Ohio, which is a bedroom community of Youngstown. So my wife and I joined Joanne whenever she came to these annual events.
That was when you were living in Bethesda, which
Right.
you still are, and it was the Virginia State Championships in Virginia.
Right.
And they came and watched, which was so nice of them. And he had a lovely wife who died about 2 years ago.
Right. And her trainer was a terrific guy, and we got to know him every time. There were
Very tough.
we went to dinner several times at the motel down in Reston, and we'd have dinner together, and we just stayed in
We
touch.
kept up.
Well, one thing I was disappointed, but also I understood in a new way the reality of college days back then was when I asked them, "Do you have any photos of the two of you in college?" And they said, "We didn't have cameras."
Oh, come on.
And the only photos that I could find were from the Athena. Whereas you guys have cell phone cameras and you take more photos in a day, than they might have had access to.
Well, being a print major, I had to take photography. In case I was out on a story, and the cameraman dropped dead or something, then you grab it. And
That
so
would be
they
a
were
story
speed
if you got
graphics, big cameras, and they certainly had cameras. That was not the dark ages.
Well, I mean, you didn't carry cameras around with you
Oh, no, I
all the
didn't.
time.
Not one of those.
If you did, you're holding out on me because I want some
Does
photos.
anybody remember speed graphics? They were huge.
Yeah.
Well, by the way,
But they
you
took
said,
wonderful pictures.
you know what happened to evening papers. A lot of them don't even know there were evening papers.
Oh, okay.
So, sorry to date.
That was
Now,
before the internet.
These photos up here, of course, that's Joanne up in the upper left.
Where? For heaven's sake.
You're over there. Microphone is gonna chase
Oh,
you.
I think I pulled something off.
Just
You
pick
did.
that up and you can walk around with it, it's fine.
Okay.
And then below the pictures of Joanne, you see photos of
Oh, for
Omicron
heaven's
Delta
sakes.
Kappa. And
That's not me, that's my sister. And the one on the right is me.
well, the yearbook had your name on there,
Oh,
so.
okay.
But you'll see Sid Davis in some of these presidents. He was president of Tau Kappa Alpha, which I think today we have as Kappa Tau Alpha. So he was the debonair guy, I believe on the left in the photo above. And then he's in this photo. This is something that I think we ought to resurrect this tradition. This is the Sigma Delta Chi, and they sponsored the newspaper ball. Now, don't you think we ought to have a newspaper ball again? It was a fundraiser.
I'm glad you're not showing my bar mitzvah picture, which I know you have. I know it's there.
How do you know I'm not showing it? Well, I thought you might enjoy seeing some of these photos. Now, we've already snuck in a little bit to your career, so let's transition to what it was like to graduate in 1952 as a woman, wanting to work for a newspaper. And I know that you talked to L.J. Horton about this. You told him you wanted to work at a big paper. What did he say to you?
He said, you're not going to do that. You have to work for a small paper first, and then you can maybe go to a big paper. So I said, no, I'm not going to do that. I think, didn't I mention going to the library? And I looked up, and I ended up at the Pittsburgh Press. And I was the lowest of the low. I got all the stories nobody else wanted, but I was a reporter. And so I think you have to, you know, in a situation like that, or any situation, when you're starting out, or any time, you have to not just like do the stories they assign you. You have to go and look for stories and be inventive and dig up your own stuff. And I was getting all this trash to write about, and so I thought, okay. So I got on the phone one time. I was on the phone at Christmas time, and I called up the postal department, and I said, are there any women mail carriers? Well, we don't think so. Women don't carry mail. But they said, we'll look and see. They found one woman in Pittsburgh, one woman mail carrier in Pittsburgh. So I did a story about her at Christmas time, carrying Christmas cards and stuff. But I think you have to be inventive and look out for yourself. You know, try to find other ways to get around what the traditions are.
I want to thank Katie Pittman, who helped pull all your stories from the Pittsburgh Press together for me. And we have some clips up here.
Oh,
Just,
I don't know how she did that.
now, the writing is
Where is
really
Katie
good.
Pittman? She must be a genius to do that.
She got the service award last night, and this is the kind of thing that she does for us. Now, there was one particular story that you told me about, and I think everyone would love to hear the story about the women in the Air Force. And we have the story up here, but it's a little hard to read. So tell us about that story, because it's an adventure.
Well, there was one, first of all, there was a city editor named Fagan, Larry Fagan. And he was a Fagan. You know, he had 7 children, and they were all girls. And he didn't want any women in the office. He wanted to get away from women. So he had to have one woman on the city desk. I was on what they called the women's pages. And so when they had a story that only a woman could do, they sometimes gave it to the woman and on the city desk, and sometimes he gave it to me. Well, the Air Force came along and convinced him, the PR people from the Air Force, that Pittsburgh was where this was a steel town, you know, in those days, and there were a lot of immigrants there. There were more women joining the WAF, that's Women in the Air Force, and more men joining the Air Force from Pittsburgh than any other city in the United States its size. Well, what's its size, you know? Is there any other city in this country today the exact size of Pittsburgh? No. Well, anyway, they convinced him. So he sent me to go to San Antonio, Lackland Air Force Base, in the middle of winter. It was a nice place to go in the middle of winter. And do a story about basic training for women. Then he sent a man to upstate New York, terrible place to go in the middle of winter, to do basic training for men. It was supposed to be a series. I got the first 3 days of the week, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. Sal Parada, the man, got Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Saturday's a lousy day. Nobody reads the paper on Saturday. So I got the best days, but it meant I had to get my stories in earlier than Sal did. So went down to San Antonio on an Air Force plane and got my story, interviewed girls from Pittsburgh who had joined the Air Force, and it was time to go back. Fagan had me calling him every day to report how it was going. So I called him up on the Wednesday, and I said, Mr. Fagan, I understand this bad weather. And I was with this, WAF. We were on an Air Force plane, and it was a prop plane. And they're telling me that they can't fly the plane tomorrow. Well, Fagan also called all women reporters. They were not dignified by having their own name. He called them Susie. So he said, Susie, you get your tail back here any way you can. I don't care how you do it, but get back here and start writing. So the WAF and I went to, Abby's shaking her head here. Anyway, so that night, the WAF and I went to the Officers Club for dinner. 2 guys came along and they said, can we join you? Well, sure. And why not? And so they sat down. Who were they? They were test pilots. And so I said, now, me, what are you doing here? This is the Officers Club and you're a civilian. Well, so the story came out that what I was doing there. And I said, I can't get back to Pittsburgh. One of the guys said, that's no problem. I have a jet. I'll fly you back. So I said, well, you're going to Washington. Oh, well, it's just a very short trip out of my way to get to Pittsburgh. How many people does this jet seat? 2. You and me. The WAF said, you're not going with him. So the next day, Thursday, my stories were due to start on Monday. The next day, the weather improved. But we couldn't leave until it got better, but it kept getting better during the day. And about 5 o'clock, they said, okay, we can leave. So we all got on, the 4 of us, the pilot and co-pilot and the WAF and me. We got on the plane, started out, and about a couple of hours into the trip, the door was open to the cockpit, and I heard the pilot say that there was trouble brewing with the plane. And I thought, oh my God. And then I heard him on the radio calling down below saying, we need to land. And so down below said, who's on board? And when they heard a reporter for the Pittsburgh Press, they said, permission denied. And he said, well, I don't care what you say, we're coming in, because we only have 15 more minutes that we can stay up here. The wings are icing up with a prop plane. And so down below they said, we will not have any lights on the runway. We will have ambulances along the runway. So he said, well, we have to land. I thought, how did I ever get in a position like this? So we went in, and he made a perfect landing, and there was a group to meet us, and they said, okay, which one of you is the reporter? I said, I am. Here are blankets and pillows and sheets. And there is the barracks empty now where you're going to sleep. And you have to go and make your own bed, and you have to be ready to leave before dawn. Someone will come and get you. So when I got back to the press, the newsroom was on the second floor, and went up the elevator, running down the hall, and there I met Mr. Fagan coming toward me. I said, "Oh, Mr. Fagan, guess what happened?" He said, "Susie, don't say anything more. I know what happened." And the Air Force had gotten to him. And he said, "I don't want a word about any of that in your story. I don't want you to talk to anybody in the newsroom about this. Don't talk to anybody about this." Well, that was 70 years ago. So I think, yes, I can talk about it. Now, there was some kind of a secret. It was some kind of a secret installation which doesn't exist anymore, I'm sure. But that was it. I'm going to stop talking. Talk too much.
No,
Good story.
it's an amazing story. But at some point, you were done at the press,
Yeah.
and you were ready to transition to New York. And you made the pivot into advertising and to the Big Apple.
No, I made the pivot into public relations.
Public
actually.
relations, okay. So talk a little bit about that transition.
Well, I wasn't getting anywhere. No women were at the press. So I figured, it's time to leave. And I was oh, another thing. The press club wouldn't allow women. So Abby's shaking her head some more. And so we had our own press club. I was president. And then I went from Pittsburgh to New York. I left on Friday, started there on Monday at J. Walter Thompson, which at that time was the largest advertising agency in the world. And I was in the public relations department for a long time. And that's how I got to New York.
Well, you had mentioned to me a little bit about this press club. We won't go into a great deal of detail, but during the reception, I would encourage you to ask her a little bit about this press club, because it became quite an important opportunity for the female journalist to have some control over who was speaking and what politicians would come and talk to you. So I think it's a very interesting story. At some point, you took up ballroom dancing competitively.
Yes, I did.
And we want to show a little clip of that, but before we do that, maybe you could share a little bit about what got you interested in ballroom dancing and how it was that you came to win the championship.
Well, sometimes life is full of changes, and you go through one stage after another stage after another stage. And if one stage, if you're stymied, with whatever you're doing, then it's important to try something new. And so my husband died, and anyway, a friend of mine was doing ballroom dancing, taking ballroom dancing, which is a social skill. It's good to know how to dance. If you're at a wedding or wherever you are, it's good to know how to do some of these things. So I thought she wanted me to come with her, so I did, and one thing led to another, and I was very bad at it at first, but I got better. And eventually I won 5 U.S. championships and 1 world. So that was,
let's take a look.
I don't know what you have up there. That's me right there. In the red dress, having an argument with my teacher.
goes on quite some time. It's very strenuous to do this.
Were the partners just random?
No, I danced pro-am. I was the am. And that was my teacher, the pro.
Well, while Joanne was making her way through the Pittsburgh Press and then making her way into PR and advertising in New York City, Sid's career started out in Youngstown. Also during the reception, you might ask him about some of his experiences as a college student down in Gallipolis at a little radio station, but we won't go into that right now, but it's an interesting story. But eventually, his goal was to get to Washington, D.C. That was really your goal, wasn't it, Sid? And so you've already kind of introduced us a little bit about your Youngstown time, but how did you finally make the jump to Washington?
Well, I was very lucky. In the summer of 1959, I was dating my woman I married, and it was serious, and I'd been dating her for 5 years, so it took a long time to get serious as far as she was concerned. In any case, I went to Washington. I did go to Washington almost every year looking for a job, but I wasn't qualified, as I said. I went to Westinghouse Broadcasting Company because they were a group broadcaster. Networks wouldn't take someone with as little experience as I know overseas experience as a war correspondent. And his name was Jim Snyder, and he liked me. He'd seen my tapes, and he wanted to hire me, but he had just hired a guy for the job. They had a job for a correspondent. They didn't know where they were going to put him. And I was very sad. I went back home with the tail between my legs and felt really goofed. I didn't move fast enough or something. 2 weeks later, this is in August of '59, he called me and said, I have news for you. The guy that I picked for this job doesn't want to come to Washington because his wife doesn't want to leave Pittsburgh. So I went down to Washington, he interviewed me again, and I started September 15th of 1959, and 2 days later, Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, is coming to Washington for a summit conference with President Eisenhower. And he said, you're going to cover that conference. I told my wife to be about it, and she went to work at the libraries. This is typical Barbara. And that night she brought home everything she could find on Khrushchev, and then we sat down and she drummed Khrushchev into my head. I went back to Washington and I made the first trip across the United States with the Premier of the Soviet Union, with all the titans of journalism, New York Times, Reston, John Hightower, Associated Press. These are the guys I've been reading about for years, and now I'm on the same press plane with them going with the Soviet premier.
7 years out of school.
Well, this is the luck of the draw. You never know what can happen to you. I got my job because of an idiot woman in Pittsburgh. Imagine he gets a job going to Washington, and one of the best times to go to Washington, and his wife says, I don't want to go there. I want to leave Pittsburgh. So it was my good fortune. You never know when things are going to come your way. And I stayed with them for 18 years. I had a great job. I covered the White House for 9 of those years. I covered actually a little over 7 presidents, starting with Eisenhower. And may I tell an Eisenhower story?
I think you should.
You have time?
Yes.
I had admired Eisenhower as a kid when I was 14 years old during World War II and the victory in Europe. And he ran the D-Day operation, which was the biggest military operation ever in world history. And he was Supreme Allied Commander there, so I followed him a lot as a kid. And when I came to Washington, they said, we're going to send you over to cover Eisenhower at the White House. And I would come in that briefing room. It was about half this size, about as wide as this, but half the size. It was the Indian Treaty Room in the Executive Office Building, which is a building, if you face the White House, it's to the right. It's across the middle alley, and that's the Executive Office Building. And every 14 days, Eisenhower, like clockwork, would hold. He was a real general on time all the time. Every 14 days, he held a news conference. They were not televised then. And you lined up outside the door at 10 a.m. And at 10 a.m. sharp, an usher would come in and open the door, and sit you down. You took seats something like this. It was not a gallery like this, a regular room. And at 10 a.m. sharp, Eisenhower would walk into the room, ramrod straight, always well dressed, ruddy complexion. He'd been on the golf course probably that morning. He played a lot of golf. And they went to the podium, and I just couldn't believe I was in the room with this five-star general, and now he was president. That was unbelievable. The thing about a five-star general is you don't tell a five-star general what to do. Don't ever try it. He had a mind of his own. He was a great general. He cared about his people. That's the biggest thing with Eisenhower is how much he cared for his men. To the lowest private in the military, he cared for all of them. Anyway, he came into the room, strode to the podium, and we would ask questions of him. His problem was he had a terrible syntax problem. His sentences got all screwed up when he answered questions. And he was that way as a general. I don't know how they understood him, but they got the message. And so one day during this first year of it was 1959, just before the 60 campaign with Kennedy taking over, New York Times reporter Charlie Moore stands up. And Eisenhower's vice president was Richard Nixon, who was not very popular, even as a candidate. He was not a nice guy. Right off the bat, I have to tell you that. I'm sorry if you're a Republican, it's true. And eventually you see what happened to him. In any case, Nixon was not Eisenhower's kind of guy. Nixon was a foot soldier, rough rider, insulter. That's his campaigns were based on accusing people of being communists. Now, saying that back then, people get mad at me, but they don't say it. They don't get mad anymore. In any case, Charlie Moore stands up, and we never thought that the relationship between a gut-fighting politician and a president like Eisenhower, who had all the awards you could get in dignity, West Point, he had the whole smear. We never thought it was a great marriage, which it wasn't. We know that from history. We know that now. Charlie Moore of the New York Times gets something. Mr. President, your Vice President Richard Nixon wants to replace you. And he's running the 60 campaign right now. Can you tell us, sir, what he's done in 8 years as vice president that qualifies him to be president? Well, I said, you can't tell a five-star general what to do. Eisenhower rarely read his briefing book. At the White House, prior to a presidential news conference, the staff puts together a list of questions they expect the president will have to answer. They call all through the government, say, if you've got a problem, the Pentagon, State Department, Interior, wherever, if you got a problem, give us the problem and give us the answer. And they put together a briefing book. Looks like a telephone book. And Eisenhower never read his briefing book because he knew it all, right? So Charlie Moore says, tell us what Nixon did in 8 years that qualifies to be president. There's silence. Eisenhower just looking blank at the report. They said, well, he's shuffling papers and he can't find it. He's looking for something, but he can't. It's too late. He can't find it. Well, if you give me a couple of weeks, I'll think of something. It was devastating. Here's a guy running for president, been vice president for 8 years. The president can't tell you one thing that he did in 8 years to qualify to be president. It was like, I can't describe how bad this was for Nixon. The fact is, it's behind the scenes. There's a book out now about Nixon by a University of Virginia writer who says that at a point where Nixon is in the end of the first term, Eisenhower calls him in for a private session. This is before he got the second term. And he said, Dick, you know, there are things you can learn to do. And how would you like to be a cabinet secretary? How would you like that? I mean, vice president to cabinet secretary. Because Eisenhower was getting complaints from probably Republicans as well. This may not make it if he runs again. And Nixon, of course, was deeply hurt and never showed it publicly. And he turned it down. Eisenhower wanted to become, I think, Commerce Secretary, where he could learn the ropes and all that. So there was not a great relationship between the two, Eisenhower and Nixon at all. It's not the case where he would have invited Richard and his wife to a private dinner in the family quarters. It never happened. According to Secret Service agents, I know it never worked. So he was already, you know what happened to Nixon, he had to resign. It was all a part of his whole history. He was a tough guy, tough operator, and it eventually got him into terrible trouble when he tried to subvert the Constitution. In any case, Eisenhower was magnificent. I just felt the highest regard for him, for the way he handled almost done the genteel way, efficient, and he never criticized another president. Never, ever. Even in the campaigns. He was straight-laced. He was a real patriot. And I always thought that he, like Ronald, I liked Ronald Reagan too. Even though I'm liberal, I would call myself a liberal. I thought Reagan was greatly underestimated for what he knew. He was a lot smarter than we thought he was. Ronald Reagan, my friend at the Washington Post, one of the reporters did his biography before Reagan ran for president, and he was interviewing Reagan. This gives you some idea of Reagan's humor and how he worked his acting career into his presidency. And reporter said to him, "Now, Mr. Reagan, you've been an actor. What kind of a president are you going to be?" "Well, I don't know. I've never played a president before." That was Reagan's charm, and that's how he handled the Oval Office. I don't think he ever lied to people. He wasn't the smartest president we ever had. He never trained for it. He wasn't military. He was in the Army in the publicity department promoting war bonds and stuff, but he did volunteer. He did military service of some kind. But Eisenhower was very special to me. I enjoyed covering Eisenhower, and the next president was Kennedy.
So let's transition to Kennedy. You're in Washington now. You're covering President Kennedy, his election in 1960. Without getting into too many details about the earliest years, but in 1963, there was a trip to Dallas in November, and this was a defining moment, I think, for your career. We should remember this was 11 years after graduating from the School of Journalism. So
11 years after what?
After you graduated.
Oh yeah, right.
And there's a piece. This is what you were handed out, and we'll come back to it in a bit. But I want to get to Sid's presentation. Somebody come
Move this chair.
Yeah. So I'm going to turn off the lights so we can see this a little bit
Okay.
better. Maurice, I think it's the first one there.
Do you hear me okay?
Oh, the other one, first one.
The other first one.
Yeah, there we go. All right, Sid, take it away. Oh.
Well, I want to say something before you roll it.
Okay.
The Zapruder film was shot by a businessman in Dallas who happened downtown when the Kennedy caravan came into town. His name was Abraham Zapruder. He was actually a clothing manufacturer. That was his trade, but his hobby was taking films of events in Dallas. And as far as I know about him, was a very honest, decent man. And he was downtown in the vicinity of the assassination where he was shooting pictures with his Bilnell camera, which you will see. I want to caution all of you. The film you're going to see on the motorcade that Zapruder shot is tragic, it's astounding in so many ways, and it is the death of a president of the United States with a shot to the neck first, and then a head wound that blows up part of his side of the head. I thought I'd tell you that if you don't want to watch it. When the video comes up, you don't have to watch it. Some people have trouble with it. All right, this is where we go. Ready? This is Jackie and the president arriving in Dallas. This is a short trip, an 8-minute trip from Fort Worth. We've been in Fort Worth overnight. He was in Texas preparing to run for president in 1964. There was to be a big Democratic powwow at the LBJ Ranch, the vice president's ranch, to plan for the 64 presidential campaign. That's why he was in Dallas. And Texas was a state that they wanted to carry. And the fact is that the reason Lyndon Johnson was on the ticket was because he could carry Texas. He was a Texas congressman, very popular. He was a Democratic liberal, very popular for the projects. He brought government projects to Texas, as a result of his power in the United States Senate and the House. And this is Dallas. The reception in Dallas was terrific. The people at the airport were friendly and warm. There had been trepidation with Kennedy coming to Dallas by the conservatives in Texas who, well, they didn't want him to win. And so there were rumblings about why is he coming here? He's a liberal Democrat. There was some of that, but nothing on the scale of what happened. There was no sign of violence at all. The crowd's behavior was perfectly nice and warm and welcoming, and that was, I'm speaking for both Republicans and Democrats. This is getting off the plane. There are about 2,000 or 3,000 people at the airport who come to see him. Air Force One has landed after a short trip from Fort Worth. This is the motorcade, beginning of the motorcade. You have Kennedy in the back seat on the right, Mrs. Kennedy on the left. The man with the 10-gallon hat is Governor John Connally of Texas, a conservative Republican, but very friendly to Lyndon Johnson. And they were actually very close friends. The uniformed people standing behind the first family are Pan American World Airways pilots, and you see some of the stewardesses. We called them stewardesses back then, not flight attendants, as I recall. And if you look to the right of Mrs. Kennedy, you'll see a guy with sunglasses and a badge on his lapel. He's very important to this story. That is Clint Hill. That is Mrs. Kennedy's Secret Service agent. Happens to be a very good friend. I've known Clint from the time before he became an agent. Next. All right. Okay, this is the motorcade. This is a shot that gives you some idea what the crowd looked like. And you see well, it's about 15 or 20 deep. For a town that was a Republican city, that was a damn fine turnout. You can see the presidential limousine. That is a midnight blue, off-the-shelf Lincoln Continental convertible. And behind it, you see the beginning of the next car, which is called the follow-up car. This is where it's a convertible, it's open. These are Secret Service agents that follow directly behind the president. The motorcycle cop is important because of the noise motorcycles made. There are no agents running alongside the car, as they usually do. The week before in Tampa, Florida, Kennedy told the Secret Service, I'm going to Dallas next week. I don't want you guys running alongside the car. I want you away from that. Stay behind me. I want the crowd to see Jackie. I'm running for president. She's very popular. I don't have to explain all this to you, but please don't get on the running boards. Actually, it didn't have running boards. This car was made with stirrups on the sides, so you put your feet, they could ride on it, but they would be facing the president, and their feet would be in stirrups on each side. On the trunk of the president's limousine, there were also holes put their feet into. If they ran after the car, they could jump on and stick their feet in the back of the car. That becomes very important to what happened here with Clint Hill. Next. That's another shot. You can see a better picture of the Queen Mary. We called it the Queen Mary. It was so big. It's a 1955 Cadillac. And you can see Clint a little better with the sunglasses. Now you see the motorcycle cop is lagging behind. He's not riding right. Usually they ride right alongside the president, so they would take the first shot if they were blocking the president's view. But they were ordered, because local police and the Secret Service were told not to go right beside the car. Next. Now you see the first shot. This is President Kennedy struck from the rear. It went through the back of his neck. It went through his Adam's apple, and it strikes Governor Connally. The bullet had to traverse through Connally's back seat and then go into him. The bullet was later found the next day on the floor of the car. So you can understand the impact and force of that bullet. That was a shot from a $19.95 off-the-shelf rifle that was purchased by Lee Harvey Oswald, the assassin, by mail order. As simple as that. Just send it in, we'll send you a gun. Now this is a still shot. You're going to see the video pretty soon. This is Clint. Now he's got his foot in that stirrup, and Mrs. Kennedy is on the trunk. The reason she's on the trunk, she sees the president being hit twice. She is on the trunk not because she's frightened. You can see a little white spot at her right hand. That is a piece of the president's skull. She's trying to retrieve it, and she does. You can look at the front, the second seat on the car, and you see Governor Conley is slumped over. He has been hit. The bullet has gone through the back seat into him and then lies on the floor. Conley is very seriously injured. He's wounded. Clint had to make a choice here. His job was to, while he was Mrs. Kennedy's agent, his main job was to save the president. His first instinct, when the shot was fired, is to run to the right, from the left side of the follow-up car to the right side of this limousine to protect the president. But he realized the presidential limousine has now picked up speed, going 70 miles an hour, 60 to 70 miles an hour, heading for the hospital. He doesn't have time to get to save the president. It's too late anyway. So alternatively, he goes for Mrs. Kennedy, gets his foot in the stirrup, and then he gets on the trunk, forces her back into the back seat. He saved her life. She would have fallen off. There's no way she could have stayed on that car at that speed. Clint stumbled at one point, almost fell into the street. And if that 8-ton car had hit him, it would have killed him as well. We're going to go coming up on the video now. This is the Zapruder film. Here it comes around the corner. This is Elm and Houston streets in Houston, in Dallas. Now you can see the presidential limousine. Watch the president carefully here. That's the first shot. That's the second shot. Now Mrs. Kennedy's on the trunk. She gets that piece of skull and gets in the car. And this will be the end of the tape. That's all the video that existed. Now, there was one guy with one camera, and there were a lot of people shooting, but their stuff was worse than Zapruder's. Zapruder's film became very famous in the investigation and in the trial. The investigation of Lee Harvey Oswald. The limousine went directly, after this happened, the Secret Service always knows where the nearest hospital is. And a guy named Andy Berger was driving the car, a Secret Service agent named Andy Berger, knew exactly where to go and headed for Parkland Hospital. Next. This is the announcement of President Kennedy's death. I want to take a second. May I take a second to explain a little bit more detail? At this point, I was on press bus number 1. I heard the shots. I heard 3 distinct shots. 2 of the shots hit Kennedy. First and third shots hit him. The first shot went through his neck and was at his apple and then out. The second shot missed. The third shot is one that caught him by the rear of the skull. That took an excellent marksman to do that. Lee Harvey Oswald had been a Marine marksman. He had won some certificate from that. So he knew what he was doing. He was shooting at a distance of 100 yards from the 6th floor school depository building, which was on the roof at an angle at the presidential limousine. The reason why I and the other reporters on the bus heard the shots so clearly was because the bus was right under the window of the motorcade, and the presidential limousine was 80 feet ahead of us. So this guy was shooting at an angle at the limousine, but we could hear the shot because we were right below the rifle. And that's why I jumped out of my seat. I didn't know what it was, but Bob Pierpoint of CBS, we thought it was a motorcycle backfiring. Bob Pierpoint of CBS News said that's not a backfire, that's gunfire. I was in Korea, I know what I'm talking about. That's a rifle shot. At that point, we realized the presidential limousine was getting out of the motorcade to head to the hospital. This is the announcement of President Kennedy's death. I was at the hospital waiting
for word. I finally got to the hospital. A wonderful black gentleman in a Cadillac saw me on the street waving my typewriter. I had no idea where the hospital was. He saw me waving, and he ran after me and got me into his car and took me. He said, "I know how to get to the hospital. Are you a reporter?" And I said, "Yes." He got me to the hospital. And I was immediately, I went through the emergency room first, and they threw me out, knowing I was a reporter, so I had to go up to the second floor, and that's where the press had gathered. They had us gathered on the second floor. I got on the phone, and I did my first report. All I said was, shots were fired into the limousine. We don't know the president's condition. The president is in Parkland Hospital. I'm at the hospital. That's all I could say. I knew nothing more than that. While I was broadcasting, a friend of mine, Hugh Sidey of Time magazine, was talking to a priest with two other reporters about 10 feet from where I was. And he kept waving at me. I was standing, he could see me clearly on the phone. I had commandeered a phone, and a young nurse, I gave the telephone to a young nurse to hold for me. She kept the phone while I ran back and forth getting information. And he waved at me to come over, and he was nasty. He was really getting animated against me. Why didn't I go over to see him? I was on the air at the time, doing my best to color the story a little bit without knowing what had happened. So finally, I told my boss on the other, Jim Snyder, the guy who hired me, I said, "Look, I've got to go." Somebody waving at me, so I went over. Just as I got there, the priest said, his name was Father Oscar Huber. He said, "He's dead all right. I just gave him the last rites." I turned around and ran back to my telephone. I said to my boss, I said to Jim, "Take me off the air." He was curious. He said, "Well, why?" And I said, "Don't ask me questions, just get me off the air." And he finally did. And I said, "Jim, the priest here says the president's dead. What do you want to do?" And he said, "What do you want to do?" He paused for a minute, thought for a minute, and he said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "We ought to hold it." I said, "Jim, it's the president. We can't go with it. I know the priest knows what a dead person looks like." And he said, "I agree." And so we did put it on the air. Now, for those of you in journalism, that is a real moment of truth, making that decision. It was my call. Some people criticized me. Some people said, "You idiot. You could have broken the story and no one would have known the difference." Time difference was so different, so small. Within 5 minutes, the assistant press secretary to President Kennedy held a briefing in this room, and that's Malcolm Kilduff. God love him. He was. This is his first briefing as a assistant press secretary. He's announcing the death of the President of the United States. The press secretary was Peter Salinger, who was on his way to Tokyo to a meeting, so he wasn't available. So Mac had to handle this. When he sat down and gave us the briefing, he opened his mouth and nothing came out. About a minute passed before he could speak the words. And then he said in a choked voice, and tears coming out of his eyes, President John F. Kennedy died today at 1 o'clock Central Standard Time. He died of a gunshot wound to the brain. I have no further information. Boom. And all hell broke loose. You had 150 reporters here in the room and for telephones. Thank God that I had this little nurse back there holding that phone for me, because they were at a premium to get on the air. And then I broadcast the fact that Kennedy was dead. I went through a lot of detail here, but I think for the journalists in the room, I think it's instructive to know how I handle it. Some people said they'd have gone with it because the priest was good enough source. I just didn't. With dealing with the President of the United States, there's so much, a lot of things went through my mind. The Russians, the Soviets, what will they do if they hear that President Kennedy's dead? Are they going to send missiles to Cuba earlier? What about the economy, the stock market? All these things impact on whatever I was going to say. And they went through my mind, but I just didn't feel confident, even though I met Father Oscar Huber later, and he knew what he was talking about. It just wasn't good enough for me. I just had to have it for more official and not killed us. provided that to me. Next. These are my notes. For those of you who know Greg Shorthand and all that stuff, that's all unfamiliar to me. I never took the time I should have. These are Sid Davis's shorthand. President John F. Kennedy died at 1 o'clock Central Standard Time today in Dallas. And then I went on to say on the next page, he died of a gunshot wound to the brain, and so on. I still have a notepad, but that's it. Next. This is a swearing in. While I was filing my story, I didn't finish telling you. While I was filing my story, a White House official, transportation official, grabbed me from behind, and I'd already announced Kennedy's death. Grabbed me from behind and said, "Come with me, you're coming with me," and I said, "I'm not going anywhere, I'm on here alive." He said, "I'm telling you, you have to come with me." And he pulled me away physically. And he picked up two other reporters in the room that he had. Two other reporters were waiting. He already nabbed two other reporters and said, "All three of you, you're coming with me. I'm not going to tell you where we're going. Follow me." So we followed him down through the emergency room, out the door, into an unmarked police car. We were thrown into an unmarked police car, and we were rushed to Love Field, where Air Force One was. I kind of figured that's where we were going. And the urgency with which Mr. Favre grabbed me, and the urgency he demonstrated indicated to me this was not his decision. And I immediately thought, LBJ, Johnson wants the president, that's swearing in. I just figured it out. We went to Love Field at about 80 miles an hour, going over front lawns, berms, weaving through traffic. The police car was unmarked. No siren used. They didn't want to draw any attention to Air Force One because they didn't know at that point whether there was another assassin. Got to Air Force One. I went up, immediately up to the forward part of the amidships, really. I saw Vice President Johnson. I overheard him say to his secretary, "Would you go back and ask Mrs. Kennedy if she will stand with us for the ceremony?" And then Malcolm Kilduff came running up from the police car, and I heard him say to Johnson, "The press is here now, Mr. President, but the Associated Press is not here. We couldn't find it. We couldn't get the guy to come with us. He was still writing." And Johnson said, "We can't wait any longer." He looked at the judge, Sarah Hughes, who was brought out from Dallas, and he said, "Proceed." And she began with the Bible and said they found a Catholic missile on the plane, Kennedy's personal missile. Johnson took Mrs. Kennedy. Mrs. Kennedy came from the rear of the plane. She did. His secretary talked to Mrs. Kennedy. She said she wanted to attend the ceremony. She needed a couple of minutes to compose herself. Her dress was spattered with blood. When she entered the compartment, I could see that blood had congealed on both her legs, mostly on her right leg where his head had been cradled in her lap. She had blood all over her right wrist that she couldn't get cleaned up. And Johnson took her compassionately. I never saw anything as more compassionate than the way he treated her. Took her by both hands. He backed up and walked her forward into the room. He placed her next to himself. He put Mrs. Johnson on the right. There were a lot of young Kennedy staffers on the airplane, on Air Force One, who would come out with Kennedy. They were in tears. I could see the mascara streaking their cheeks. The crying got louder as she came in more into the room. And Johnson turned to Judge Hughes and said, "Proceed." And he started the oath. I clocked it at 28 seconds. He embraced or kissed Mrs. I couldn't see the kiss. UPI guy, Merriman Smith of UPI, was one of the other pool reporters. He said she kissed, he had a better view. He said he kissed her. I just wrote that he embraced her. And he kissed Mrs. Johnson. And at that point, Johnson, after finishing the oath, he knew the Secret Service wanted to get that airplane out of Dallas. So he said, "Let's get airborne." I'll never forget his, with a firm voice, "Let's get airborne." Jim Swindle, the pilot up front, took the order and cranked up all engines. And then Malcolm Kilduff, the press secretary, came to me and said there are only 2 seats left for the press on the airplane. Smitty, the wire service guy, gets 1 seat. You and Chuck Roberts at Newsweek, you have to flip. And I thought for a minute, and I said, Chuck, I'm getting off. And I said, you take the trip. And it served both of our purposes. Chuck was a magazine writer on Newsweek magazine. They go to press 24 hours later on Saturday night. This was a Friday. I'm in broadcasting. They need me every second. Every second I'm wasting, they're not getting the story. So that's why I volunteered to get off, because I had to give my company the story. However, under the rules of being a pool reporter for the White House Press Corps, you cannot use the story yourself until you give it to everybody else. So everybody gets it at the same time. And that's when I was hoisted on a car, and I gave the pool report down in Love Field. And I got back to the White House at midnight. These are some of the nicest guys in the world. These are the White House correspondents I worked with for 7 to 10 years. Really. John Chancellor, people like that. They were the best. Thanks.
So that's you standing on a car.
That's me on standing on. They lifted me up on the top of the trunk of a car. And then the interesting thing here you may be interested in is that the New York Times reporter was Tom Wicker, one of their outstanding correspondents. The Times has to know everything. Man, they don't stop with just a smattering or a brief description. He wanted to know everything. So after all these guys here from the print medium were running for the telephones, and there were only 3 phones at the field for all these guys to use. We had a fight for phones. In any case, Tom Wicker with the Times kept asking me questions. I'm sweating and I'm thinking, I got to get out of here and file my story. And Wicker saying, what did she wear? What were her shoes like? What was it like? This goes on for 5 minutes. I'm dying to get off the scene so I could fight for a telephone. But they had to have all the details. And, well, it's a, you notice I had hair there. Anyway. This is the funeral 3 days later. This is on Monday. And this is little John. I put that in there because it's poignant. This is Mrs. Kennedy. She helped arrange the funeral. We had all of the world. Charles de Gaulle came to the funeral. They were all walking. She walked with all of these world leaders down Pennsylvania Avenue. She walked behind the hearse, which carried the casket. She really was a great lady. Now let me point something else out here if I have the time. Mrs. Kennedy could have said when Johnson issued the invitation to her to attend the ceremony, not knowing what her answer would be. I know why he did it. He wanted her in the picture, of course, and it was the right thing to do. She didn't have to come to be in that picture. She had enough grief. Imagine losing your husband and seeing the way he died. But Mrs. Kennedy, to her credit, realized the value of being in that picture, the famous swearing-in picture. And that's why she was there, because she was her duty to be in that picture. Had she not been in the picture, all the gossip columnists, and maybe all of us in the press, would have written stories of why wasn't she there? Is she mad at Johnson? Is she mad at the country? Mad at Dallas? But she was gracious enough. She realized throughout history that the most important thing on that photograph of the swearing-in is that she was present, even though her husband had been killed. She stood beside his successor in support of him. Johnson's compassion was unbelievable. The airplane took off a few minutes later at 2:38 p.m. Central Standard Time. He was killed at 1 o'clock. And Mrs. Kennedy sat in the back of the airplane with her hand on the casket all the way to Washington. When an aide came to her and said, why don't you, Mrs. Kennedy, we have some fresh clothing for you that you brought here. Why don't you freshen up or get cleaned up? And she said, no, I want them to see what they have done. Now at that point, she didn't know who the killers were. None of us did. But thank God it wasn't anybody in Dallas that lived there normally or in. Lee Harvey Oswald was a loner. He didn't get along with people. He had problems in the Marine Corps. He went to the Soviet Union at one time. No one seems, even to this day, we don't know why, because he was killed. 2 days later, he was shot by a bar owner in Dallas. I've used this, but this is a Bill Malden, so for you folks that are a little older. Bill Malden was a famous World War II cartoonist, and his stuff was very famous all over the country. He was also a friend of John Kennedy's. And 2 days later, this appeared in the Chicago Sun-Times, and then it was printed all over the world, of Lincoln in tears. It's his Malden's depiction of how he thought Lincoln, he just thought the country ought to see a picture like this on the sadness of the occasion.
I can see.
This is the,
With her hand on the casket.
this is an ambulance. Can you stop it for a second?
Yep.
I want you to know this vehicle. I've now come back to Washington on the press plane. Incidentally, White House correspondents drink an awful lot. Pan Am World, we have as much on a Pan American World Airways press plane as fuel in the tanks on that airplane. And that was so that trip back, the silence and the stewardesses were very accustomed. These are regular hand-trained stewardesses for the White House press corps. They knew our working hours, they knew our shifts, they knew when we had to work and when we had to eat, and they've scheduled everything that way. And what they did was they turned the lights out. Once we left Dallas at 10 o'clock that night, I stayed in Dallas until 10 p.m., then we headed back to Washington. And they turned the lights out on the plane so we could work, and they had these little spotlights in the airplane over your typewriter typing. I was typing my stories. Actually, I wrote a letter to my children, but to one of my sons. But I have to tell you that not a drink was, all the way back to Washington, there was silence. Nobody said a word, and there wasn't a drink served. It just the honor of it. In Dallas, while we were in Dallas, the press corps we worked out of the Dallas press club while we were waiting for the departure at 10 p.m. for Washington. And that's where we had dinner, and I remember a wonderful reporter who worked for the Los Angeles Times, he actually knew Kennedy. He wrote a book called PT 109, and he had been in the Navy. Bob Donovan. He said to the bartender, a large, handsome guy, Negro, he was black, and he said to him, "Can you get us a bottle of scotch?" And the waiter said, "No, I can't." You know, can't you get us a bottle of booze, a cheap bottle of booze or something? We're all thirsty, and so on and so forth. He said, "The law says we can't. They close the bars." And Donovan tried to pulls out a $20 bill, and this guy says, Donovan said, "Why don't you just break the law? Give us a bottle." I'll never forget this guy's word. He said, "Enough laws have been broken in Dallas today." That's so profound curtain on what we did there. And as I said, going back to Washington, all these tough guys on the airplane could not say a word all the way back to Washington. I got right at the office somewhere around midnight. They sent me to the White House, and I was posted on the White House lawn, and the body came back. It had been in the Bethesda Naval Hospital where they did the autopsy. I want you to notice this car. You see a siren on top of it? Well, when I was on the air, this is a broadcast that I did on near 4 a.m. on the day after, as the bodies brought back to the White House. That is an ambulance. That is not a hearse. The Secret Service went down to transportation people at Bethesda Naval Hospital and said, "Mrs. Kennedy wants an ambulance. She does not want a hearse." That tells you something. If the Kennedys don't die, they don't talk about death. She did not want the president's body in a hearse. It was too final. And so this young man said, "You can't have one." The Secret Service came over to the guy and he said, "Son, if I were you, I'd get a hearse." And they brought a hearse, and that's how it brought to the White House. Anyway, this is my broadcast for a Scotch company that did a piece for PBS and National Geographic. And you'll hear my voice on here. For those of you who are going to broadcasting, let me just tell you one thing about this. there's an old expression, they had it in my work, where I grew up and worked in Youngstown. It was on the wall in the studio where we broadcast. And it says in bold type, facing the microphone of where I would sit or the other people sat, if you are not sure, don't do it, don't say it, don't play it. That's a rule, so you don't get to say something stupid or bad on the air. I want you to hear this broadcast because I was pretty stupid, I thought. This is my broadcast for a documentary, broadcast on PBS and the History Channel.
With her hand on the casket, and I started to feel the finality of what had happened. I told them we ought to go back on the air.
There's very little more we can say. In a manner of speaking, perhaps, John F. Kennedy has come home. We like to quote from Robert Frost many times on the campaign, and one of the president's favorite quotations, and I believe it was something like this: I have promises to keep and many miles to go before I sleep. And with that, this is Sid Davis, reporting from the White House.
I should not have quoted Robert Frost because I didn't think I'd get through it. It's amazing how many letters I got in the mail. People found me afterwards and told me what their sympathies were. On Monday morning before the funeral, I driving downtown. It was almost like a holiday. Nobody's there. They're getting ready to go later in the morning, go to the funeral. And a woman was standing alone at a bus stop. And I stopped and picked her up and said, are you going downtown? She said, yes, I was heading to my office. And she started to cry, and she said, I'm a Republican, but she said, I never knew how much I loved you. I think because Kennedy was a war veteran, there was a feeling across the country that they at least respected him at that time. I will have to tell you this, that I think later on during the last months of his presidency, if he stayed, and the stories came out about his extracurricular activities, that probably that election would not have been as easy for him as people thought. It was 1960s, and that behavior was not acceptable at that period. And I just thought I told Bob I wanted to use this because if you're going into journalism, pick a spouse that's going to be involved with you to some extent. If you're going to be a reporter and you think you're going to work 9 to 5, forget it. It takes a lot of family to support 24-hour days away from home, weeks away from home, etc. This is my wife Barbara, whom Joanne mentioned, and that's my son Larry. Larry is today a physician, and that's me at the ramp on Air Force One. I wanted to point just a lighter moment after all this tragedy. Lyndon Johnson he didn't always like the press. He didn't like Donald Trump. He had arguments with the press too, not to the extent that Trump does, but he would invite us to go on Air Force One lots of times. And if we had a family, if you were only the pool reporters would fly Air Force One. Not everybody could. There were only 4 seats for the press on Air Force One. He felt that just if you felt that you were with the president and what that airport means, what that airplane means. I want to tell you, you fly this airplane into any country in the world, and the crowds see that airplane land on their airfield. They go crazy. We sometimes don't realize the strength we have and the feeling about our country people have all over the world over. It is astounding when you see when this airplane lights it all up. This airplane was designed by a famous designer, Rowe. I can't remember. Raymond Loewy. he designed railroad engines, but he was also a great artist. And Mrs. Kennedy helped design this airplane that says United States of America clear across the fuselage up above. That's what turns the people on. I've been to Israel, I've been to India, I've been everywhere. And that just lights up the crowd when that airplane lands. No matter where you go, Japan, no matter where you go with that airplane, it just lights everybody up. That's Barbara, and that's Larry, and that's me. And LBJ used to arrange with Pan Am for our families. He discounted the price of round trips to Texas when he went there for long stays so we could bring our spouses, our wives or husbands along, because he felt, I believe, that we wrote better stories about him when we had our spouses with us. Thanks. I showed Martha's picture because she really was a part of the team, and she worked with me on a lot of speeches. She would do the research on a lot of the speeches, and she's a perfect wife for someone with the absences that I had. I thought I'd close with this. This is the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. It's only 35 words. And the reason why I bring it here is because this is the only business that is mentioned in the United States Constitution. Press. I want Donald Trump to read that every day. Thank you.
Can you say something about the handout, and then we'll applaud, but the handout, I think
this is a article written by Joan Sid of Time magazine. He was outstanding. He wrote about the presidents. As a matter of fact, he knew more presidents than anybody that I knew. And when President Reagan was shot, the White House was insisting, when I was bureau chief at NBC News, big time operation, I have to tell you that. And it was a great honor for me to be there. I loved the people. I loved working with them. And it's the biggest job I ever had. Actually, what I did at NBC News was I practiced psychiatry without a license. You have to meet all my correspondents, Andrea Mitchell and all of those, to understand what I'm talking about. They're wonderful people, but they can drive you crazy. And Sid, one day when after Reagan was shot, he saw an article that was critical of me in the New York Daily News by the famous gossip columnist Liz Smith. And he called me about it. The gossip columnist said that I deprived one of my reporters of a scoop. And it was terrible what I did. The reporter had gotten into George Washington University Hospital where they took President Reagan. But the White House insisted that President Reagan wasn't shot, that he was only there because a Secret Service agent had been shot, and he wanted to stop on his way back to the White House to say hello to this agent the guy was doing. So the word from the White House was, the president's okay. I usually, when a big story of this happened, I would go out in the newsroom and take over the coverage. So I said, we're not going on the air until the White House tells us he's been shot. It's too complicated. We don't have the other information. What happened was one of my reporters, Ken Bodie, had gotten into GW Hospital and got to talk to an orderly, a guy who pushes the stretchers around, just a kid. And the kid said to him, you see that x-ray there? Bodie was right outside the emergency room. They had 2 x-rays up on a screen. And the kid said, that one on the left is President Reagan. You can see the bullet hole in his chest. And Bodie got that, called the office, and he said, the president's been shot. He's here. I'm here. Put me on the air. And he was arguing with the desk, and I took over. And I said, Ken, we're not going with the story. You've got to get a doctor. You cannot just take this. How old is this guy? He said, about 20 years old. I said, you got to get a doctor. He said, Sid, if I go ask for a doctor, they're going to throw my ass out of here. And they did. And we waited for the official announcement. Well, the gossip columnists went crazy on that. Ken, I don't know whether Ken manufactured the story or who did, but it was all over the place. And he was at an airport in Detroit, and he sees it in the Daily News, calls me in Washington, what happened? And I told him what happened, and so he wrote this thing. And I told you I want that as my obituary. I've never had people say anything like this to me before. But there's another case of have to make a call. And, just think of what would have happened if I said President Johnson, President Kennedy was dead, and he wasn't dead. Well, think of what would happen, the same with Reagan. You never lived, in your entire career, you would not live down a mistake like that. And I wasn't going to do it. I was just not old enough to do it. I thought the journalism students would like to know that. Thank you.
I'm sure there are 2 or 3 questions that are burning, and then we will move over to Lasher Learning Center for a little reception. But what kind of questions come to mind from this conversation? Yes, Jack.
Yes, first comment. You talked about President Eisenhower and Richard Nixon. It might be of interest to you and others in this audience that Richard Nixon's family came from Benton County, Ohio.
Oh, really?
Richard was born, Nixon was born in Whittier, California, but his father and grandfather were from MacArthur, Benton County. That's a comment.
Yeah. Well,
Second,
the thing about Nixon is that I don't know how much time you have want me to talk, and I take the time away from Joanne. She'll forgive me, I know.
Sure.
When Nixon, when I talk, I sound like I was terribly cruel to you. You'd have to understand the differences between Eisenhower and how he got to where he was and how Nixon got to where he was. Nixon got where he got to because he hit below the belt. He called all of his opponents communists, pink lady. One Helen Gahagan Douglas in California ran for the Senate. She wasn't sick. Congresswoman or something. He called her the pink lady, little signals like that. That means you're a communist. I had no evidence that she was a communist. She's liberal, she was a communist. Jerry Voorhees, another Oklahoma communist. He got away with all of that. He got to be a congressman, he got to be a senator, he got to be vice president, president, and he got away with it. And Eisenhower knew all that. So Eisenhower did not, it was not Eisenhower's first choice. When they came to him as vice presidential candidate, he had misgivings about it. I happen to know that the Nixons, and she was a wonderful wife, and I know she's a wonderful lady. There was differences between the two were miles. But Nixon is a great American tragedy because he could have been different, and he wasn't. And I want to explain that. I don't want to be harsh on the guy just out of the blue. It was just the thing. I did the live broadcast when he resigned, the day he resigned, and I felt so sorry for him. He had terrible complexion problems. He had to wear makeup all the time. He wore makeup when he wasn't on television. There were certain things that were problems. His appearance was not very good. He was a nasty politician in so many ways, and so many enemies. Eisenhower did not want that kind of a vice president, so he tried to get him off the ticket once. And then Watergate was a chronic disaster for him, planning to burn down the Brookings Institution to get information, to get this guy, get that guy. 31 members of his staff went to jail, were indicted. They all took the rap for him. And the day he resigned, I went with him on the 60 campaign. I was on his first campaign trip, and I saw the relationship between him and his wife, Pat, but they say it wasn't that great. In any case, he was in the East Room. He's saying goodbye. Tears are streaking through his makeup. You could see the makeup. And he said, only if you've been in the lowest valley can you know how magnificent it was to have been President of the United States on the highest mountain.
And all this time to have been a good president. He didn't need Watergate. He had the elections. Compare that with Ronald Reagan. Magnanimous, he never took credit for anything. He once said, "There's nothing you can't accomplish if you don't care who gets the credit." And Reagan never took credit for anything. That was a group thing, or he never assigned himself to doing it.
I might just follow up. You two have talked about your friendship that you established back in 1948, 1952, but since you graduated from Ohio University, and I think this would be of importance to the students, not only have you maintained a friendship, but you've kept a relationship going with Ohio University. And perhaps you might want to just comment on the importance of that, how you, through all these years, if you don't mind, Bob.
Actually, I was going in that direction, so thank you for that. And I think this is an area that Joanne can really shine. She is a great role model, so maybe you could talk about this.
Well, when I left Ohio University, I went to Pittsburgh, as I said, and one of the first things I didn't know anybody, I joined the alumni club. And it was a way to meet people and, make friends and so forth, and I did the same thing in New York when I went there. And I recommend that to anybody. It's just, you meet people that have a lot in common with what you know. Then I got active in the alumni club in both cities, and I've always been a supporter of the university.
By supporter, you could be more specific than that. You've been a very generous donor to the university, and this is in your DNA. If you weren't at the banquet last night, may I say a word about the lumber in Cutler Hall was a gift from a great-great-grandfather, Harold, Christopher Harold, in 1817, I believe is when the gift was made. So this is the first
No,
gift.
the building was built before that, but that was,
You forgave the debt.
yes.
Yeah, and that was the gift of all the lumber in
Mhm.
Cutler Hall. So this is in our DNA. We have Harold lumber in the DNA of the university. So that tradition of giving is something that you personally have carried on.
Yes. Well, my family lived in Athens for a long time. I mean, my ancestors did. I didn't, except at college, of course. But yes, they lived here a long time until my father moved away. But a lot of them went to Ohio University, and a lot of them were farmers around here and so forth.
Well, this has been a great day for me to be able to bring this conversation to you, and I really appreciate you coming out. And now we're going to step across the hall to National Learning Center.
Can I say something?
Sure.
I was at the ceremony yesterday, and I told this to Bob. I've never seen anything like this. I speak at large journalism schools, and I've never seen something as big, as beautiful as this. There's so many
It was
awards.
wonderful.
The banquet.
From the smallest, it doesn't matter how big the award was, the fact that you did it, and the mixed nature of the recipients is unbelievable. I mean, I just couldn't believe what I was seeing, how many awards were passed out last night. 3,000.
A couple zillion, I think. It seemed like a couple zillion.
It was remarkable. And
85? Yeah, and if you count the foreign correspondence scholarships, I think I want to say 300,000.
Gosh, that's
really
wonderful.
wonderful.
So very generous donors, and as I mentioned last night, Joanne has sponsored a color scholarship, and Abby Marshall and Abby Jeffers both are the beneficiaries of that, and it does make kind of a difference, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So very pleased that we're
I
able
say
to.
one word, but you mentioned Drew Evans. I did know Drew. She was a graduate student she was a student and graduate student. So I think she graded papers for last year. She did
She graded your papers, I think.
Yeah.
She didn't do enough. I was not a great, I'll just be honest with you, I just didn't do as, I wasn't as good a student as I should have been. I paid more attention to other things than I did in that.
You could have been somebody, Sid.
They knew me on campus, but not the scholar.
I remember when the first class I went to was George Starr Lasher, and maybe you remember this too, Sid. I think we were in the same class. He said, this was journalism class, and he said, right off the bat, none of you is Ernest Hemingway. None of you is as good a writer as Ernest Hemingway, and therefore, I don't give any A's.
Does that sound familiar?
We thought,
We have a George Starr Lasher clone on the faculty.
Well, I'm an example of the fact that if you're not a great student, that's not the end of the line. You've got time to make amends.
Yes.
I was just going to comment, since you had brought up Drew. I was at her 90th birthday party a couple weeks ago, and I happened to be next to her when the current editor of the Columbus Dispatch came up, and he was one of her students.
Yep.
And I guess they've kept in contact, but anyway, as they greeted one another, he just said, I guess I probably wasn't your best student. And she said, no, you weren't, but you came out all right.
That's
So
true.
you get the last word.
Right, she did.
Well, it was wonderful that Drew was there last night, and you'll be happy to know that when she came up to give her award, she got a standing ovation. And many of the students in this room don't know much about Drew, because it's been quite a long time since she taught. But she is really the direct ancestral line to George Starr Lasher.
mhm.
So, and when you go over to Lasher Learning Center, you'll see some photographs of Lasher, but also his daughter, Mary Elizabeth, when she was a college student. And there's a wonderful photo up on top of a bookcase where you see George Starr Lasher making a really scowled face, and you see his daughter, Mary Elizabeth, making a really scowling face. And then you notice every student in the room is doing a really scowling face. So somehow that set the tone.
He had another daughter too, Dorothy.
Yes.
And Dorothy was my roommate.
Oh my goodness.
And I used to go into class, and sometimes I would be a little bit late, and he would say, oh, class, let's stop and let Miss Wood come in. Or not Miss Wood, I wasn't Miss Wood then, I was Miss Harold. And it's nice you could join us today. And I used to think, he goes out of his way because I'm his daughter's roommate. He goes out of his way to embarrass me, but I should have been on time, of course. It was my fault.
Many of you may not know that Mr. Lasher's wife was killed in a car accident when the girls, the daughters, were quite young. So he reared those girls himself. And he lived in an apartment right above the college bookstore on the corner, looking out over the Civil War monument.
Bob, I've known Bob now since we got the job here, and I've come to Ohio U several times, not as often as I probably should have. But I'm really impressed by what I've seen here in the last 2 days, with what this university is today compared to what it was, especially in communications. It is fantastic. I went through the hall where the studios are and the people are. You got to be very proud of this place. I am, certainly am. This trip has been an eye-opener for me.
You're standing on the shoulders of giants.
Well,
That's what we're doing. Please join me in saying thank you to Joan Sid. Let me get your microphones off so you can wander them out.
And then, yeah, we probably should have to do that.